Katherine Mansfield presents, featuring the best horror stories of the 19th century. Welcome to the Poe Show Podcast. Narrated by Katherine Mansfield. Today's episode, Leves Amores by Katherine Mansfield. I can never forget the Thistle Hotel. I can never forget that strange winter night. I had asked her to dine with me and then go to the opera. My room was opposite hers. She said she would come, but could I lace up her evening bodice? It was hooks at the back. Very well. It was still daylight when I knocked at the door and entered. In her petticoat bodice and a full silk petticoat, she was washing, sponging her face and neck. She said she was finished and I might sit on the bed and wait for her. So I looked round at the dreary room. The one filthy window faced the street. She could see the choked, dust-grimed window of a wash-house opposite. For furniture, the room contained a low bed, draped with revolting yellow, vine-patterned curtains, a chair, a wardrobe with a piece of cracked mirror attached, a washstand. But the wallpaper hurt me physically. It hung in tattered strips from the wall. In its less discolored and faded patches, I could trace the pattern of roses, buds, and flowers, and the frieze was a conventional design of birds, of what genus God alone knows. And this was where she lived. I watched her curiously. She was pulling on long, thin stockings and saying damn when she could not find her suspenders. And I felt within me a certainty that nothing beautiful could ever happen in that room. And for her I felt contempt, a little tolerance, a very little pity. A dull gray light hovered over everything. It seemed to accentuate the thin tawdriness of her clothes, the squalor of her life. She too looked dull and gray and tired. And I sat on the bed and thought, come this old age, I have forgotten passion. I have been left behind in the beautiful golden procession of youth. Now I am seeing life in the dressing room of the theater. So we dined somewhere and went to the opera. It was late when we came out into the crowded night street, late and cold. She gathered up her long skirts. Silently, we walked back to the Thistle Hotel, down the white pathway fringed with beautiful golden lilies, up the amethyst-shadowed staircase. Was youth dead? Was youth dead? She told me as we walked along the corridor to her room that she was glad the night had come. I did not ask why. I was glad too. It seemed a secret between us. So I went with her into her room to undo those troublesome hooks. She lit a candle on an enamel bracket. The light filled the room with darkness. Like a sleepy child, she slipped out of her frock, and then suddenly turned to me and flung her arms round my neck. Every bird upon the bulging frieze broke into song. Every rose upon the tattered paper budded and formed into blossom. Yes, even the green vine upon the bed curtains wreathed itself into strange chaplets and garlands, twined round us in a leafy embrace, held us with 1,000 clinging tendrils. and youth was not dead. Hello and welcome back to the Poe Show. I am your host, Tynan Portillo. I wanted to do a bonus episode for Pride Month, so happy Pride. If you enjoyed this story by Katherine Mansfield, then subscribe to this podcast, share it with others, and give me a suggestion for classic stories or poems that you'd like to hear on this podcast. Just check the episode description and click the send us a link text message to text anonymously, or you can send an email to poshowpod@gmail.com. Katherine Mansfield, or Kathleen Mansfield Beauchamp, as she was also known, was born in Wellington, New Zealand in 1888, and she died in 1923. And as is all too common with the authors featured on this podcast, she too died of tuberculosis. Her most famous works are included in 3 collections of short stories that she wrote throughout her lifetime: In a German Pension, Bliss and Other Stories, and The Garden Party and Other Stories. She wrote a ton. Most high school students might actually know her from her short story The Fly, but her most adapted work has been The Doll's House. Now, the reason I thought it appropriate to feature Katherine this month is because there is strong evidence to show that she was bisexual. Based on my research, I would also say that she was as well. And for an author from the classic eras to be a part of the LGBTQ community is a rare thing indeed. But let's learn a bit more about her. In 1906, she had visited England with her family and wrote in her journal on her boat ride home about a men's cricket team on board, saying about one of them, quote, "When I am with him, a preposterous desire seizes me. I want to be badly hurt by him. I should like to be strangled by his firm hands." Well, damn, Katherine, that was, I guess you ran into some kinks, huh? Evidence shows that she had 3 main partners with whom she had relationships in her life. That was Mata Mahupuku, Edith Kathleen Bendall, and Ida Constance Baker. She had lived with Ida for about a year towards the end of her life, but Katherine met Mata at her private school, and their close bond worried the school and their parents. Now, this could have been because they thought the girls could be attracted to one another, or it could have been because Mata was Maori, a race of indigenous Polynesian people in mainland New Zealand. As an adult, she had written about Mata, saying, "I want Mata. I want her as I have had her, terribly. This is unclean, I know, but true. What an extraordinary thing. I feel savagely crude." This story, Leves Amores, was written when Katherine was only 19, based on a real place close to her home in Wellington, and its literal translation is casual love. This story was based on her experiences with Edith Bendall. She had later written, quote, "I feel more powerfully all those so-termed sexual impulses with her than I have with any man. I feel that to lie with my head on her breast is to feel what life can hold. Pillowed against her, clinging to her hands, her face against mine. I am a child, a woman, and more than half man. We lay down together still silently, she every now and then pressing me to her, kissing me, my head on her breasts, her hands around my body, stroking me lovingly. What an experience! And when we returned to town, small wonder that I could not sleep, but tossed to and fro, and yearned and realized 1,000 things which had been obscure." Isn't that just a beautiful piece of text? As far as the men in her life, Katherine had become pregnant with a man named Garnet Trowell, but his parents refused to let them marry, so she married George Bowden in 1909 and remained so until their divorce in 1917. Now, their marriage is a bit of a tornado. It's really unclear what kind of relationship they had. I read one thing It was a student's dissertation that George Bowden himself was homosexual, but I did not find any evidence of that. The evidence is that for most of their marriage, they just didn't live together or see each other. And she was known to have actually rejoined Garnett a week after her marriage to George. And she lived with a man named John Middleton on and off for a few years during her marriage. Now, after her divorce from George, she remarried in 1918 to John Middleton, who was an editor and actually edited most of her work after her death. Now, what those changes were, I guess we will never truly know. Katherine had no children due to some miscarriages and becoming infertile later in life due to gonorrhea. I wish we could know more, but sadly, Katherine destroyed most of her own journals between 1906 and 1912. Katherine was not an outspoken feminist, but her work speaks to many early feminist ideals and feminine rage. The Woman at the Store from 1911 is her story that depicts sexual attraction, rage at men who use and abandon women, and the overwhelming feelings of isolation women have experienced in their struggles. It's sufficient to say that she inspired freedom and independence through her written word more than her politics. Her work is actually considered to have spearheaded the literary movement of modernism, which rejects conventional plot structure and dramatic action, instead focusing on exploring the nature of character through the narrative voice. As we heard in this story, nothing really happens in a traditional story structure. There's not a hero story structure, and she only alludes to the dull world around her coming to life as the women embrace each other, again, exploring the character. Virginia Woolf greatly respected Katherine and even wrote in her own journal soon after Katherine's death, quote, "I was jealous of her writing, the only writing I have ever been jealous of." I hope you like this story and learning about a classic author who had such a great impact on modern literature and who was unapologetically herself. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Post Show. If you enjoyed it, then give this podcast a good review so it can get to more people. Subscribe to this podcast for future episodes. Share your favorite episode and follow on Instagram and Threads at The Post Show Podcast, on TikTok at Post Show Podcast, and on YouTube at The Post Show. All links to the social info can be found in the episode description. Now have a good one, and you'll hear from me again in the next episode of The Post Show.